I thought what I'd try and do is shape what I'm saying to what I see as a core issue here, and try and give it a bit of a backstory that I hope might illuminate the things which we're talking about as well. And if you wanted a summary of the key issue in a way that I think we're wrestling with, you can say this in many different ways, of course, but it's what it is to be an individual. What is it to be individuals? And particularly to live in a time where the individual, quite rightly, very often is seen as sovereign. You know, one person, one vote, all equal before the law. There are still relatively new aspiration for global education. There are probably as many women in this room as there are men, if not more. These kind of sides of life where we very much value the individual, but at the same time brings many of the problems that we're talking about as well, and particularly those associated with alienation, loss of connection with the land, mental health, and so on. And what I thought I'd do is use the ideas of this chap to try and unpack some of this. Now, this is Owen Barfield. He lived through quite a process of consciousness change himself. He was born when Queen Victoria was still on the throne and died 6 months after Tony Blair became Prime Minister. He's best known as one of the Inklings, this Oxford group that included J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I don't know whether you're more of a Lord of the Rings man or a Narnia woman or the other way around, but both Lewis and Tolkien said that Barfield actually had the best ideas. He's not so well known because he wasn't such a great writer as both of them, but nonetheless he had a very powerful, I think, idea of what's going on in our times, and told a backstory that I hope illuminates it. And I'm going to try and sort of rush through some of those ideas now. He broadly said that we're going through a kind of evolution of consciousness, which is to say, over the last 3,000 years or so, that's how far he took it back, our perception of what it is to be human, what it is to relate to ourselves, to nature, to the cosmos, to the gods, has radically changed. His preferred sort of shape to describe this change is actually a U-shape. If you're into the evolution of consciousness, people like Ken Wilber or Alan Watts, various people that talk about this previously and now, different images are used, sometimes more linear images, sometimes more spiral images. Barfield's preferred image was the U, and his broad idea was that we're living at a time where we're descending down the left arm of the U, finding ourselves somewhere at the bottom and working out how to reascend up the right side of the U. And the idea is that the ascent is a return but with crucial differences. And to cut to the chase, the crucial difference is with all the benefits of particularly the freedom that come with being an individual, but with no loss of the connection or a regaining of the connection which our ancestors knew. And hence the title for my talk today. So let me unpack this a little bit further. He thought that about 3,000 years ago, our ancestors experienced what he called original participation. Participation is just his word for how we participate with life. Original, he meant it's sort of at the origins of our consciousness now. Clearly you can track it way back before, say, the time of Homer, say before the time of the Hebrew prophets and the oldest bits of the Hebrew Bible, the Vedic texts in India, pre-Lao Tzu, pre-Confucius in China. You can track it before then as well into the Neolithic and even the Paleolithic. But nonetheless, around the time, maybe sort of 5,000 years after the emergence of agriculture, the reason why Barfield got interested in this time is he was a philologist and very interested in how words change their meaning. And he realized that words, you can treat them as fossils of consciousness, as well as how we communicate. That if you can track how words have changed meaning, then you can track something about how the consciousness of the people that use them have changed as well. So it's quite a robust theory. That's one of the reasons why I quite like it. And he thought that you can trace this original participation, which was a much more immersive sense of what it was to be human. There was very little sense of what's me and not me, mortal, immortal, my creatureliness, other creatures around and about. And the word, just an example of a word that illustrates some of this is the word, say the word pneuma. That's the Greek. In Hebrew it would be ruach. There's other words in different languages which do the same thing. But it's the word which we now have to translate in one of three ways. The word pneuma, we have to decide whether we're going to translate it as either wind or breath or spirit. Whereas, say in Homer, it means all three things. Even in actually the New Testament, a relatively recent text in this schema, the word pneuma, as used in St. John's Gospel, means all three things, and that an English translation now typically changes wind into a metaphor for spirit. So you can begin to see, I hope, that there's a kind of disconnection that comes about through the last 3,000 years. And he thought that it leads to what he called a withdrawal of participation. And this is both a process of alienation, but comes with the great gain of individuation as well. That a growing sense of interiority that belongs to you as a human being emerges, rather than, he argued, the participation before, which was where your sense of identity came very much from the outside in. Older cultures, very preoccupied with relationship with gods, for example, or with nature, and much of their wisdom and their use of, we've heard all about plants today, libations, rituals, and so on, are very much about trying to learn how to relate from the outside in order to keep your sense of self. Barfield argued that with this withdrawal of participation, you get a sense of interiority emerging for the first time that's relatively autonomous, can be regarded as responsible. Words like conscience, free will, authorship, a whole range of factors start to become really important to human beings. As Jung summarized it, the gods became diseases often when it comes to mental health problems. So the goal is to try and regain a sense of reciprocal participation, which means both the sense of your own individuality, but one that can step back out into the inside of the whole world, as Barfield called it, something that's reciprocal in some kind of relationship. And it's been very encouraging for me today to hear some of this sense of reciprocity being searched out, as we were just previously hearing now, where there's both the sense of all the gains of individuality, but trying to recover some of the losses as well. Let me illustrate this a little bit further, I hope by showing some images that track this shift of participation. This is images from ancient Egypt, and I think one of the things that's so fascinating about going to, say, the British Museum, going to the Egypt galleries, going to other galleries that reach back to these times is that you know that you're in a human space, but it's a very different human space from the one we have now. And broadly speaking, I think it can be accounted for with this sense of outside-in consciousness. So here we have an image of one of the great pyramids at Giza. We know that now that they weren't built by coercive labour. This was a voluntary labour. The archaeology has shown that workers were very well cared for. It was clearly quite a good way to live. And yet it's very fascinating that the whole economy would have been required to put up these enormous pyramids within, say, the lifetime of a pharaoh. So the sort of sense you get from Barfield's insight is that much as we pursue things, our own sense of, as it were, career path throughout life to develop our sense of selves. This was done at a collective level, and a pyramid would be an example of that. That it was seen as a fulfilling way, you might say, to organize your economy, because in the life of the pharaoh, who was the kind of figurehead for the whole people could find some sort of sense of meaning and direction and purpose as well. I think it's particularly fascinating they decided to build pyramids, because it's now quite a natural thing for us to think of a kind of inner pyramid. If you know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'll know he pictures them as pyramids with the kind of basic needs at the bottom rising to a kind of pinnacle at the top with self-actualization. A sort of nice illustration of how what was on the outside we've kind of taken in now. Another very fascinating thing you'll notice if you go around these Egyptian galleries is how animals, body parts, sort of seem to float free often in this consciousness. And broadly the idea is that you didn't conceive of yourself as an individual relating outside with a kind of integrity or wholeness yourself, but rather you experienced yourself as a kind of, a collection of spirited factions, that your relationship to gods like Horus, as in the Horus eye, was required in order to get that sense of self, this sense of outside in once more. So you worshipped animals because an animal stood for a part of yourself that also was in relation to the god that the animal represented as well. So animal worship, body parts apparently floating free, was a way of relating to the spirited faction that was yourself. And there's even linguistic evidence that supports this idea. In Homer, for example, the word soma which became body, as in what you and I have, a body, originally didn't mean a living body, it just meant a corpse. And it's as if they could only identify the soma, the corpse, when the spirited factions had left. Because when the spirited factions were there, you had a kind of integral relationship to the cosmos as a whole, figuring in the one person, rather than an individual with relative autonomy as we imagine it now. You can look at other bits of evidence of this. This is a scene from Homer's Iliad. You might recognize that this is one of the moments when Achilles again loses his temper, and this time he decides he's going to strike Agamemnon dead. But what's so interesting about the story is that he doesn't, as it were, have a crisis of conscience and thinks that would be a very bad thing to do. Instead, Athena, with her shield there, she appears and pulls back his head and stops him from doing it. And in this consciousness, gods appearing, spirits appearing, and as it were, you working with the gods in order for eventualities to come about, to gain a sense of agency, was the spontaneous and natural way of doing it. So in the story, Athena appears and stops Achilles from doing it. I think you get a similar kind of remembrance in the famous Hebrew story of Isaac being slain almost by his father Abraham. If you can just see, this is Caravaggio's famous representation of it. We now think, what on earth was going on? Abraham being told to slay his son by God, how immoral is that? Well, in the story, of course, it's an angel appears and tells Abraham about the ram in the thicket, and so Isaac's saved. And I think what you get in the story is this old memory of how the sense of what to do, who you were, came from the outside in this case, and with the appearance of the angel. And the story's remembered because it's a sort of transitional story. It's as if it's trying to remind us of something that we've partly lost, but also gained with our moral sense. And so we have the sense that it's an immoral story, but also wonder what on earth was going on, and maybe something's being lost as well. The afterlife is another very fascinating area where this consciousness shifts. And broadly speaking, you can track this through quite a lot of cultures. The idea originally was that when you died, you returned to your ancestors. It's why clan sacred grounds, sacred burials, ancestor cults, and so on are so important. That you, as an individual, in inverted commas, you, as it were, rose into mortal life for a time and then returned to your ancestors in the afterlife. And so it was very important to be buried in the right ancestral ground. That starts to change, particularly in the Greek period and in the Hebrew period. I'm going to focus mostly around the Mediterranean, where people start to have the hope of a kind of afterlife for the individual as well. Something you don't, again, see in Homer, but you start to see in the period just before the Christian period, 0 AD. Things start to change. So there's a bit of some sense of the old way. Now, you can actually track this change happening almost before your eyes in the British Museum with the way that statuary changes, figurative statue changes particularly, only in a period of about 100 years. And I often think there's a bit of good news here, that actually very dramatic shifts in human consciousness, in the past at least, have changed in very quick periods of time, just in 2 or 3 generations. So these are famous images of the male and the female. We tend to think of them as kind of archetypal figures now, the choroi and the chors, from about, say, the 6th century BC and before. And you can tell it's a human being, but it's a very stylized human being to our consciousness now. And indeed, they're done to very strict sacred proportions, as if they're mirroring an archetypal image of what it is to be a man or a woman that you then as an individual would learn how to relate to in your devotion to these objects. Starts to change only about 20 or 30 years after the last of the core and the choroi were made. And when the figures, I hope you can just make it out, they start to have little sort of nudges towards individuality. A knee might be bent. Corners of the mouth might be put in as if in a smile. Different gestures with the arms start to appear. And the body starts to look like it's been worked on rather than just conforming to a sacred image. This guy on the left here looks like he might have been to a gym, for example. And then, of course, just 100 years later, you get what now for us has become almost defining images of beauty. You can debate beauty endlessly, but if you do, you're probably going to relate to some kind of beauty like this, either accepting it or rejecting it. And what's so amazing, I think, about these figures is that you immediately sense not just the physical appearance, the beauty of the physical appearance, but also the mental poise that's in these figures as well. You know, the Discobulus, he there has not just got a beautiful body, he's got the extraordinary mental poise that's required to throw the discus, release it at just the right moment in order for it to go the furthest distance. There's a kind of virtuous beauty in these figures. And the figure on the right there is from a Hellenistic queen. I mean, she is supposed to intimidate you with her physical beauty, but also with her divine beauty, you might say as well, which comes from the inside out. So I hope there's some sense there of how these things change. Now, I wanted to talk about one figure in particular who in Western consciousness has become so important, the figure of Socrates. We relate to Western philosophy and regard it as somehow the origins of our sense of life, as we know it now at least, because of figures like Socrates. And he made very, very interesting comments, as Plato put it, that gives us some clues to begin to know how to live with this new consciousness, this new sense of individuality. So here's a remark from Plato's Apology, where Socrates says, I have a divine or spiritual sign. It began when I was a child. Now, a bit like reading Shakespeare, you have to read Plato and get meaning out of every single word. It is a divine or spiritual sign, Socrates is saying. It's still related to the gods. I mean, in fact, Socrates felt that he had a particular relation to Apollo. I think he related to Apollo because in Greek, Apollo means not many. Like hoipoloi means the many, Apollo means not many. And it's like he was using the god Apollo to try and gather him sense of himself not being many, not having this kind of scattered pantheistic sense of who he was. But nonetheless, he's still relating to the god. He felt that he had a demon, a kind of message, a go-between from Apollo. It was well attested, not just in Plato, in other sources as well, that he had this sense of inner connection with Apollo. Very interesting, he just makes this remark, it began when I was a child. Now again, just the earliest inklings of developmental psychology in that. You never read about children before this time, and in fact, it takes quite a long time for developmental psychology to get going, even after these early sort of nudges from Plato and Socrates. But nonetheless, this sense that the individual is undergoing a development. It's not just about what the timeless gods have told you through the myths and how those have developed across time. There's a sense of individual development appearing here. He says it was a voice, and whenever it speaks, it turns me away from something I'm about to do, but it never encourages me to do anything. Now, this is a very fascinating way of describing it, because you might say it's a negative way. The god doesn't tell him what to do, like Athena pulling back the hair of Achilles anymore. It tells him what not to do, and leaves him in this sort of space of not knowing, of struggle. But the great thing about the place of not knowing and struggle is that in order to make sense of what the god has told you, you've got to work on yourself. You've got to work on your own individuality. And so, with Socrates, becomes the possibility that you can become a kind of co-worker with the god. And that the god, as it were, is calling you not just to do what the god says, maybe learn through some divinatory technique, oracle, vision, whatever it might be, but leaving you in a space of not knowing and struggle in order that through the difficulty there, you might become more fully yourself and more fully aligned with what the god wants, with what Apollo wants in Socrates' case. And I think this is like a first big clue that Barfield picked up on as well. That our struggles and our distress, panic, worry about things like meaning of life, how we're supposed to live better and so on. Barfield said there's a sort of silver lining to these clouds, which is this is something calling for something from within us in order that we might grow through this process. I work as a psychotherapist much of the time, and I think one of the things that psychotherapy latched onto very early on is that the pain that you might be suffering, it may not be just a question of easing the pain in order to return to an old life. There may be something in the pain that's leading you to a new life. I think it's no coincidence that Freud, every time he mentioned Plato, he talked about the divine Plato. And there's some sense of how I think psychotherapy is trying to build a wisdom practice for our times that was first started to be developed by Socrates and Plato and the other Hellenistic philosophers. Now, it became generalized, I think, with the emergence of Christianity. Christianity means many, many different things to many, many different people, and is many, many different things, in fact. But just to pick up on one thread here, my sense is that through the Hellenistic period, what Christianity did was work out how to democratize what had otherwise been a rather elite philosophical practice. Particularly in figures of the Christ, this became sort of turned into icons. Here's a figure of Christ from Hinton St Mary in this country, I very much like it because it's Christ as Apollo. It's a beardless Christ depicted as a deity, but with the Cairo of Christ depicted behind him. And I think that what the figure of Christ started to teach people was that much as Christ was said to be both fully human and fully divine, there was something about his humanity, and particularly the suffering of his humanity, that led to a full sense and transparency of the divine. So too, people began to feel that this was something that could be achieved by all individuals over the early Christian centuries. Early Christians fought endlessly about this, but often what's at stake is the sense of what it is to be an individual in this now. And the law changes, things like plagiarism start to be talked about for the first time, because this sense of ownership and individuality start to emerge. Free will, conscience start to appear through the Christian period. And you get eventually towards the end of Christianity's dominance, certainly say in the West, art like this, where these figures have a very powerful sense of interiority as well as connection with the world around them. I think the Renaissance often so much appeals to us because of this link between the individual and nature. These are definite figures with definite interior lives going on, caught very poignantly by the artists, and yet there's some sense in which nature, the distant horizon, the mountains, the transcendent even, is somehow in sync, is reciprocally related to what's going on for the individuals as well. Renaissance imagery often has this full consciousness. If you're into Ian McGilchrist, he highlights on this as a both sort of left and right brainedness that comes together in the Renaissance. But we struggle with it now. I'm going to skip over this. This is a sort of divine element, the idea that you can have both a sense of human individuality here. This is Hildegard of Bingen's image of it, but also the human mind can range over the cosmos as a whole, a bit like a god within. And you pick it up in other traditions as well. If you read the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, sorry to flash up these words, or indeed commentaries in Taoist texts, they pick up on quite a similar idea. Leave that to one side for now, so I'm pushing towards the end. We now live in the modern period where there's been another withdrawal of participation. You can, again, tell this story in many, many different ways, but quite a pivotal story that's often told is in relation to Copernicus with his heliocentrism, the idea that the sun's at the center of things, not the earth. Actually, I think the real significance of Copernicus and Galileo wasn't the idea that the sun was at the center of the universe. This was actually quite an old idea. There were Greeks that talked about it. But what they said, what they did was they also created the sense that you as an individual could stand outside this experience of the universe in order to look on. You could have, as it were, the view from nowhere to study it. And I think that's really the radical step that they took. So here's an image of a human individual traversing the cosmos from before the 16th century. And if you can just make out this after the 16th century bookplate has the human being set outside the universe as a whole. And this is both the great genius of the scientific step as we know it, and also the great bane of the scientific step, is that if you're stepped outside of the cosmos, how can you possibly step back into it? If you're into the history of words, words like subjective and objective start to emerge and mean opposite bipolar, I said bipolar, that's a bit of a Freudian slip, opposite things, with the objective being regarded as the trustworthy and the subjective being regarded as somehow dodgy or difficult. Barfield then summarised that and said, look, what we've got to realise, this in a way is our task, to realise that consciousness is not a tiny bit of the world stuck onto the rest of it. It's the inside of the whole world. And the task is how we're going to go about that. So just to draw to a close, I think the broad way that I try and go about this is trying to look and to see where this is happening and then go with the flow of it. And rather than feeling I've got to somehow sort of hack my brain, devise a technology from the outside in that's going to shift everything, I think that's too much what Barfield called unresolved positivism going on in it. Rather, we've got to, in our very method, look for how we can immerse ourselves back into the cosmos, but with individuality. I think you see it with a certain new kind of expansive science, and particularly the interest in nature once more. And this is actually an old tradition of science. It's a romantic tradition of science. Words like nature, actually, in ecology, they came out of this romantic tradition. Figures like von Humboldt that immersed themselves in the nature of the world they were, in the soul of the world they were studying, and realized that there was a way of relating to it that could become a science of ecology ontology in itself. I clearly think interiority matters. Here's Freud's famous couch. I think maps matter. So rather than having one, as it were, definitive idea of how we should develop, we need different kind of maps that can help us just take the next step. And that's very much what you try to do in psychotherapy. You maybe borrow a bit of Melanie Klein, or you borrow a bit of Donald Winnicott in order to help the client take the next step forward. And that's what counts, movement and progress in that sense. An area that hasn't quite been touched on today, that maybe it's been on people's minds, I guess it's on the fringe of psychedelics, but is how people still are having visions, they're still having paranormal experiences, they're still experiencing synchronicities, and in the sci-fi world, often putting these onto the big screen or into books. And I think we need to listen to this kind of supernova of activity that's going on, but discern it and bring our individuality to it as well. Personally, I don't think it's about sort of smashing the ego. I think it's about learning how the ego can relate to these experiences. So again, to quote a bit of Jung, how it can become the servant and not a master. But a lot of this is going on. It's quite a sign of hope, I think. And it's becoming more and more possible to talk about it in terms of discerning these things as well. And just a sort of final point. I think another kind of key area where there's a lot of difficulty in the discussion is what do we do about our ontology? Do we think that, as it were, consciousness is just something that goes on inside our head? Or do we think that our consciousness, the brain is perhaps an antenna that can pick up the consciousness that's the inside of all things? In sort of orthodox science, that's still pretty taboo, but nonetheless, people are starting to talk about it broadly because the consciousness problem has never been solved in any other way. And I think we've got to get a bit more ontologically committed about our sense that there are gods, at least some kind of panentheism, where our individuality is trying to learn to relate to the deities around and about. Consciousness will continue to evolve. The question is how it's going to evolve next. The good thing about being individual is that you can sort of nudge things by learning to go with the flow, by picking up the signs, bringing your own personal development in relation to the development of the world around and about us. And if you just forgive a final plug, I've got a book coming out on about all this this month, in fact. The Secret History of Christianity. I've tried to hook it to Christianity because I think it's a sort of pivotal ideology where our secret, meaning inner history, has emerged and shaped. Jesus, the last inkling, my spiritual guide in this, Owen Barfield, and the evolution of consciousness. I hope that sort of big story, thank you for giving me the time to rush through it, illuminates some things we're talking about today.